Progress Requires Persistence by Enlight Audiobook is a powerful guide to developing the mindset, discipline, and resilience required to keep moving when motivation fades, progress slows, and the finish line feels far away. Introduction. There is a peculiar moment in every worthwhile pursuit when the excitement disappears, but the destination remains. The notebook is still open, the goal is still written down, and the promise you made to yourself is still somewhere in the back of your mind, but the urgency that once carried you forward has gone quiet. This is where progress becomes personal. Beginning is often accompanied by possibility. Continuing is accompanied by evidence. You begin believing that effort will quickly produce results. Then reality introduces delays, mistakes, repetition, uncertainty, and days when nothing seems to change. The temptation to step away can become stronger precisely because the reward is still out of sight. Persistence is what separates a temporary intention from a meaningful commitment. It is not stubbornly forcing the same door when another entrance exists. It is the resilience to remain devoted to what matters while having the intelligence to change your approach. It is discipline when motivation becomes unreliable, patience when progress becomes invisible, and courage when failure makes retreat feel reasonable. You will discover that finishing what you start is rarely about possessing extraordinary strength. More often, it is about developing an ordinary strength repeatedly, returning to the work, learning from the setback, adjusting the course, and taking the next deliberate step. Progress does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is quietly being built while you are wondering whether anything is happening at all. And sometimes the person who keeps going becomes the person who eventually gets there. Chapter 1. When motivation runs out. The first few days of a new ambition can feel almost effortless. A fresh notebook seems to carry more possibility than paper should. A new business idea feels inevitable. A gym membership feels like evidence that change has already begun. Even a difficult goal can appear strangely manageable when the mind is still intoxicated by possibility. But somewhere between the decision and the result, the emotional weather changes. The excitement becomes ordinary, the work becomes repetitive, the results remain distant, and suddenly the same goal that once energized you begins to feel like an obligation you never agreed to. This is where persistence quietly enters the story. Consider the experience of James Dyson, whose name eventually became associated with innovative vacuum cleaners and engineering design. Before his products became widely recognized, Dyson spent years developing prototypes and encountering failure after failure. His journey involved thousands of unsuccessful attempts, each one capable of convincing a reasonable person that the idea was not worth pursuing. There was no permanent surge of motivation carrying him through those years. There were experiments that failed, designs that disappointed, financial uncertainty, and long stretches in which progress was difficult to see. What kept the work alive was not an endless supply of enthusiasm. It was a willingness to remain engaged with the problem long enough to learn from it. That distinction matters far beyond invention. A student preparing for an important examination discovers that studying every evening is considerably less exciting than buying the books. Someone trying to become healthier realizes that the discipline required on an ordinary Wednesday is far less glamorous than the decision made on Monday morning. An aspiring writer discovers that having an idea is exhilarating, while revising the same paragraph for the 5th time is strangely humbling. A person building a business may spend months working without the reassuring applause that accompanies visible success. In each case, motivation makes an attractive entrance, but persistence must handle the long middle. Motivation is useful, but it is volatile. It responds to novelty, emotion, encouragement, visible progress, and immediate rewards. When these conditions disappear, motivation often retreats with them. That does not make motivation weak or useless. It simply means it was never designed to carry the entire weight of a long-term commitment. Depending entirely on motivation is like expecting favorable weather every day before agreeing to travel. Eventually, the sky changes. Commitment operates differently. Motivation asks, "Do I feel like doing this today?" Commitment asks a more consequential question. Is this still worth doing? The first question is emotional, the second is deliberate. When the answer remains yes, action can continue even when enthusiasm has become quiet. This does not mean forcing yourself through every difficulty without reflection. Persistence is not a refusal to think. Sometimes exhaustion is telling you to rest. Sometimes repeated failure is telling you to change your strategy. Sometimes a goal that once mattered no longer deserves your time. Mature persistence leaves room for all three possibilities. Its strength lies not in blindly moving forward, but in knowing why you are moving, what you are learning, and when the route needs to change. The danger comes when temporary feelings are allowed to make permanent decisions. A difficult week can persuade someone to abandon a 5-year ambition. One poor result can suddenly become proof that they are incapable. A period of silence can be interpreted as failure, yet circumstances fluctuate far more quickly than meaningful goals should. What feels like a final verdict in an exhausted moment may simply be an unpleasant chapter in a much longer story. The ordinary days reveal more about persistence than the dramatic ones. Anyone can become energized by a breakthrough. The deeper question is what happens when there is no breakthrough. Can you return to the work when nobody is praising you? Can you continue learning when your first attempt was embarrassing? Can you tolerate the uncomfortable distance between effort and evidence? Can you remain patient without becoming passive? These questions are not merely about achievement, they are about self-trust. Every time you follow through on a meaningful commitment, despite temporary resistance, you provide yourself with evidence that your intentions have substance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop seeing yourself as someone who merely starts things and begin seeing yourself as someone who can remain with them. That transformation rarely arrives dramatically. There is no ceremony for the moment when persistence becomes part of your character. It happens through ordinary decisions, opening the book again, making another call, practicing another hour, returning after disappointment, correcting the mistake, or simply refusing to let one discouraging day dictate the shape of the next one. The excitement that began the journey may eventually disappear. That is not necessarily a warning sign. Sometimes it is an invitation to discover whether the goal has become important enough to survive without excitement. Because when motivation runs out, you finally discover what your commitment is made of. Chapter 2. The Power of One More Attempt. Failure has a peculiar talent for making a temporary event feel permanent. A rejected application can suddenly sound like a verdict on an entire career. A failed business idea can make every future idea appear naive. One disappointing examination can convince a capable student that perhaps intelligence was never on their side. The mind has a tendency to compress a complicated story into a single painful sentence. It did not work, therefore I cannot make it work. Yet failure rarely possesses the authority we give it. More often it tells us that one attempt, under one set of conditions, produced one particular result. James Dyson learned this lesson through repetition rather than theory. Before the Dyson vacuum cleaner became a recognizable product, Dyson spent years refining a design that challenged conventional vacuum technology. He reportedly went through thousands of prototypes before arriving at a version he believed in. Each unsuccessful prototype could have been interpreted as evidence that the concept was flawed beyond repair. Instead, each one exposed another weakness in the design. The failures were frustrating, expensive, and time-consuming, but they also narrowed the distance between an imperfect idea and a workable one. What eventually looked like innovation from the outside had been constructed through an extraordinary willingness to remain in conversation with failure. There is an important distinction here. Dyson did not simply make the same attempt thousands of times and hope that probability would suddenly become generous. He adjusted, tested, observed, and tried again. That is the difference between persistence and stubbornness. Stubbornness clings to a method because changing it feels like admitting defeat. Persistence remains loyal to the objective while remaining flexible about the route. This distinction matters in ordinary life. A person applies for 10 jobs and receives 10 rejections. The first rejection feels disappointing, the 10th can feel personal. Eventually, the applications begin to look less like opportunities and more like evidence. Perhaps the resume is not strong enough. Perhaps the interview technique needs work. Perhaps the positions being targeted are poorly matched to the applicant's experience. The productive response is not to send the same resume to another 100 companies while calling that persistence. It is to investigate what the rejections are revealing, improve the weak points, and make another attempt with greater precision. The phrase, "try again," sounds simple, but emotionally it can be demanding. Trying again requires a person to return to the place where confidence was damaged. It means reopening the subject that disappointed you. It means risking another rejection when the previous one is still fresh. That is why another attempt often requires more courage than the first. The first attempt carries possibility, the second carries memory. Yet something valuable happens when you make another thoughtful attempt. You stop allowing the previous result to define the next decision. You reclaim a degree of authorship over the story. The failure remains part of what happened, but it no longer gets to decide what happens next. Consider a student who performs poorly on an important examination. The easy interpretation is that the student is simply bad at the subject. A more useful interpretation asks what actually happened. Perhaps the student memorized information without understanding it. Perhaps the study schedule was unrealistic. Perhaps anxiety disrupted performance. Perhaps too much time was spent reading and too little time practicing. These explanations are not excuses, they are information. Once the problem becomes specific, it becomes possible to respond to it. This is one of the quiet powers of persistence. It converts vague disappointment into useful questions. What went wrong? What was within my control? What assumption did I make? What should I change? What remains worth pursuing? Failure becomes less threatening when it becomes something you can examine. There is also a danger in expecting every attempt to produce visible improvement. Sometimes the second attempt is better, but still unsuccessful. The third may reveal another weakness. The fourth may simply confirm that the strategy needs further revision. Progress is not obligated to arrive on the schedule of our impatience. A person can improve substantially before the outside world notices any difference. This is why persistence requires emotional maturity. You must learn to tolerate the space between making a better effort and receiving a better result. That space can be uncomfortable because human beings naturally crave confirmation. We want evidence that our sacrifice is working. We want the rejection to stop, the numbers to rise, the skill to improve, the door to open. But meaningful development often occurs before external validation catches up. Another attempt, then, should never be an automatic act of repetition. It should be an informed response to what came before. If the first approach failed, study the failure. If the environment was wrong, change the environment. If the skill was insufficient, acquire the skill. If the expectation was unrealistic, recalibrate it. If the goal remains meaningful, return with more knowledge than you had before. There is a profound difference between starting over and continuing differently. Starting over suggests that everything has been lost. Continuing differently recognizes that experience has accumulated. The failed attempt is no longer empty effort. It has become part of your education. Eventually, persistence becomes less dramatic than people imagine. It may simply look like opening the application again after rejection, returning to the manuscript after criticism, practicing the difficult skill after another mistake, or walking back into the room where yesterday's confidence collapsed. Nothing about the moment may feel heroic. Yet character is often built in precisely these unremarkable decisions. You do not need to know that the next attempt will succeed. You only need enough clarity to understand why it deserves to be made. Sometimes the door does not open because you are knocking too softly. Sometimes you are knocking on the wrong door, and sometimes the door is simply not going to open. Persistence is the wisdom to distinguish among these possibilities without allowing one closed door to convince you that there are no entrances left. The next attempt matters because it carries something the previous one did not. Your experience of having already failed. You know more now. You have seen the obstacle from the inside. You understand where the method broke down. You have discovered something about your patience, your preparation, and your assumptions. Failure may have taken something from you, but if you study it carefully, it can leave knowledge in its place. One attempt can tell you whether an idea is possible. Another can teach you how to make it possible. And sometimes the distance between disappointment and progress is nothing more mysterious than the courage to return with a better approach. Chapter 3. Learning to live with slow progress. There is a particular kind of frustration that appears when you are working hard and the world seems unwilling to provide evidence. You wake up, do the work, make the effort, repeat the routine, and then look for some visible sign that all of it is moving you forward. Sometimes there is nothing. The numbers barely change. The skill still feels awkward. The opportunity has not arrived. The body looks almost the same. The business is still small. The manuscript is still unfinished. The silence can become so convincing that you begin to wonder whether your effort is accomplishing anything at all. Yet some of the most consequential progress in life develops quietly, long before it becomes recognizable. Colonel Harlan Sanders offers a remarkable example of what it means to remain engaged with a goal while results refuse to appear quickly. His story did not begin with immediate success or effortless recognition. After years of different jobs and setbacks, Sanders eventually developed and promoted his fried chicken recipe, but widespread success did not arrive early in his life. He traveled from restaurant to restaurant, presenting his recipe and facing repeated rejection. What makes his story particularly striking is not simply that he eventually became associated with a globally recognized brand. It is that the breakthrough came after years when a younger person might have concluded that the opportunity had already passed. His progress was slow enough to test his patience and delayed enough to challenge the assumption that success belongs only to those who begin early. The deeper lesson is not that everyone should wait indefinitely for a miracle. It is that meaningful progress does not always follow the timetable we assign to it. We often judge an effort by what it has produced today, even when the effort was designed to produce something much later. Consider learning a language. During the first weeks, improvement can be exhilarating because new words appear quickly. Then the novelty fades. You spend months understanding more than you can speak, recognizing phrases but struggling to construct them yourself. The improvement becomes difficult to measure because your old ability and your new ability are separated by countless tiny changes. One day, you suddenly understand a conversation that would once have sounded like meaningless noise. It feels like a breakthrough, but the breakthrough did not happen that morning. It was assembled quietly through hundreds of earlier repetitions. This pattern appears everywhere. Financial stability is often built through decisions that seem unimpressive when viewed individually. Physical fitness develops through ordinary sessions that rarely look dramatic. Professional expertise grows through years of solving problems that nobody applauds. Confidence develops through repeated encounters with situations that once intimidated you. Even relationships become stronger through countless small acts of reliability that would seem insignificant if examined in isolation. The difficulty is that human beings are naturally drawn toward visible rewards. We want evidence proportional to our effort. If we work for 10 hours, we would like 10 hours of visible progress. If we practice for a month, we want a transformation that can be measured immediately. Reality is less accommodating. Some forms of growth accumulate beneath the surface, while others require a long period of repetition before they become noticeable. This is why comparison can be particularly destructive during slow seasons. You look at someone else's finished product while standing inside the unfinished portion of your own. Their promotion becomes evidence that you are behind. Their successful business becomes evidence that yours is failing. Their physical transformation becomes proof that your effort is inadequate. But comparison often places two completely different timelines beside each other and pretends they are the same story. There is also a psychological trap in expecting constant improvement. When progress is treated as something that must be visible every week, normal fluctuations begin to feel like failure. A writer has an unproductive week and assumes the talent has disappeared. A person saves less money one month and believes financial discipline is collapsing. Someone misses a few workouts and concludes that the entire effort has been wasted. The mind prefers dramatic conclusions because they are easier to understand than gradual change. But slow progress asks for a different kind of intelligence. It requires the ability to recognize movement before it becomes impressive. You begin to notice that you understand something faster than you once did, recover from mistakes more quickly, make fewer careless decisions, or require less effort to perform something that previously exhausted you. These changes may not create a dramatic story, but they are evidence that the person you are becoming is different from the person who started. Patience, therefore, should not be confused with passive waiting. Patience is active endurance. It is continuing to perform meaningful actions while refusing to demand immediate proof that they will succeed. It does not mean ignoring results or pretending that everything is working. It means giving a worthwhile process enough time to reveal what it can actually produce. There will be moments when you need to reconsider the goal. Persistence should never become an excuse for wasting years on something that clearly deserves a different strategy. But before abandoning a meaningful pursuit, ask whether the problem is truly failure or simply the discomfort of not seeing results yet. Those are not the same thing. Some progress arrives like a door opening. Other progress is more like a room gradually becoming brighter as your eyes adjust. Nothing appears to change at first, yet eventually you realize you can see details that were invisible before. The work was not producing fireworks, it was producing capacity. That is why the quiet seasons matter. They teach you whether you can value development before recognition, improvement before applause, and consistency before evidence. Anyone can become enthusiastic when results are obvious. The deeper form of persistence begins when the evidence is still incomplete. You may not be able to see everything your effort is building today. That does not mean nothing is being built. Sometimes progress is simply too young to introduce itself. Chapter 4. Discipline when you don't feel like it. There are mornings when ambition feels remarkably distant. The alarm rings, the room is still quiet, and the task you promised yourself you would complete suddenly seems far less important than it did the night before. Nothing dramatic has happened. You have not abandoned your goal. You simply do not feel like doing the work. This ordinary resistance is where discipline earns its reputation. Not in moments of inspiration, but in the unremarkable hours when desire offers no assistance and the decision to continue must come from somewhere deeper. Motivation is emotionally persuasive because it makes effort feel lighter. When enthusiasm is present, difficult work can seem almost enjoyable. You begin earlier, concentrate longer, and forgive inconvenience more easily. But motivation is inconsistent by nature. Sleep, stress, disappointment, boredom, environment, and countless small events can alter how willing you feel from one day to the next. If your progress depends on feeling ready, your progress will inherit every fluctuation of your emotional state. Discipline offers a different arrangement. It does not ask whether the task is exciting. It asks whether the task still deserves to be done. Consider a person trying to write a book while working a demanding full-time job. During the first few weeks, the project feels thrilling. Ideas arrive quickly, pages accumulate, and the possibility of finishing creates its own energy. Then, ordinary life intervenes. Work becomes stressful. Family responsibilities increase. Some evenings produce only exhaustion. The writer opens the document and stares at a blank page with the uncomfortable awareness that inspiration has apparently chosen another address. There are two possible responses. One is to wait until the desire returns. The other is to create a smaller obligation, write for 20 minutes, revise one page, or develop a single paragraph. The second approach may not produce a magnificent evening of creativity, but it keeps the relationship with the goal alive. This is one of the most useful principles of discipline. Difficult days do not always require maximum effort. They require continuity. People often misunderstand discipline as an aggressive form of self-control, as though becoming disciplined means forcing yourself to perform at full capacity, regardless of circumstances. That interpretation eventually becomes exhausting. Sustainable discipline is more intelligent. It creates structure strong enough to preserve progress without demanding perfection. On an excellent day, you may do more. On a difficult day, you may do less. What matters is that you do not allow temporary difficulty to become permanent disappearance. The difference may appear insignificant, but it can reshape an entire life. Reading 10 pages when you wanted to read 50 may feel unimpressive. Practicing for 15 minutes when you intended to practice for an hour may seem inadequate. Saving a small amount when you hope to save much more can feel disappointing. Yet the smaller action protects something larger. Continuity. It tells your mind that the difficult day changed the scale of your effort, not the direction of your life. This is where routines become powerful. A routine reduces the number of decisions you must negotiate with yourself. When a behavior has a predetermined place in your day, you no longer need to conduct an internal debate every time it arrives. You study because 7 o'clock is study time. You exercise because your schedule has already made room for it. You review your finances on a particular evening because that is when you do it. The routine quietly removes the question that motivation repeatedly asks. Do I feel like it? Environment matters as well. A person trying to concentrate while surrounded by constant interruptions is not necessarily lacking discipline. The environment may simply be working against the intention. Removing unnecessary friction can make persistence considerably easier. Preparing the materials beforehand, keeping distractions away, defining a specific working period, or deciding the next action before ending the previous session can reduce the psychological distance between intention and execution. The goal is not to become a machine. Human beings require rest, recovery, flexibility, and moments of genuine disengagement. A disciplined person can recognize exhaustion without turning it into an excuse for permanent retreat. There is wisdom in knowing when to pause, and equal wisdom in knowing when a pause has quietly become avoidance. Perhaps the most underrated function of discipline is that it protects your future self from the temporary moods of your present self. Tonight, you may feel convinced that tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, however, may bring another reason to postpone the task. Discipline creates a bridge between what you want eventually and what you are willing to do repeatedly. Over time, these repeated acts of follow-through begin to alter your relationship with yourself. You stop needing constant persuasion. You develop evidence that your decisions have weight. A promise made privately begins to carry credibility because you have watched yourself honor it before. That is where discipline becomes more than a productivity tool. It becomes a form of self-respect. The most persistent people are not necessarily those who possess extraordinary willpower. Often, they have simply learned how to make the right action easier to repeat and the wrong action harder to justify. They understand that intensity can create impressive beginnings, but structure creates durable continuation. There will always be days when you do not feel like doing what matters. That is not a character flaw, it is part of being human. The important question is what happens next. You can negotiate with the feeling, or you can acknowledge it and continue anyway. You can demand that the day become perfect before you act, or you can work with the day you actually have. Discipline begins when the mood stops being the manager of your commitments. It is the quiet decision to keep your direction even when your emotions change their mind. And when that decision is repeated often enough, persistence stops feeling like something you have to summon. It becomes something you have learned to live. Chapter 5. What failure is trying to teach you. Failure rarely arrives with the courtesy of an explanation. It simply leaves you standing beside an outcome you did not want, wondering what went wrong and sometimes what went wrong with you. A business closes, an interview goes badly, a relationship ends, an examination result disappoints, or a carefully prepared opportunity passes to someone else. In the immediate aftermath, the mind is rarely interested in analysis. It wants a verdict. It wants to know whether the failure means you were not capable enough, intelligent enough, prepared enough, or simply destined to lose. But failure is often far less personal than it feels. An unsuccessful outcome can contain valuable information, provided you are willing to examine it after the emotion has settled. The first challenge is separating what happened from what it means. A person who fails an examination did not necessarily prove that they are incapable of learning. A rejected entrepreneur did not necessarily prove that they cannot build a successful business. Someone who performs poorly in an interview did not prove that they have nothing valuable to offer. The event is real, the interpretation is a choice. Yet when disappointment is fresh, those two things become dangerously easy to confuse. Consider a young professional who spends months preparing for a promotion. She takes on additional responsibilities, stays late, learns new skills, and begins to imagine herself stepping into the position. When the promotion is announced, another colleague receives it. The disappointment is immediate. For several days, she interprets the decision as a judgment of her entire professional worth. She considers withdrawing, doing only the minimum required, and quietly searching for another job. But after the initial frustration subsides, she asks a more useful question. What did the person selected demonstrate that I did not? The answer is uncomfortable but valuable. Her technical work was strong, but she had rarely communicated her ideas beyond her immediate responsibilities. She solved problems efficiently, but had not developed the leadership presence the role required. Her failure did not reveal that she lacked ability. It revealed that her definition of readiness had been incomplete. She had prepared to perform the job, but not sufficiently prepared to demonstrate that she could lead others. That realization changes the meaning of the disappointment. The rejection remains painful, but it becomes informative. Instead of merely working harder, she begins presenting ideas in meetings, mentoring newer colleagues, volunteering for cross-functional projects, and developing the communication skills she had previously considered secondary. Months later, another opportunity appears. Whether she receives it or not is almost beside the point. The first failure has already done something valuable. It has expanded her understanding of what growth requires. This is the overlooked intelligence hidden inside setbacks. Failure can expose assumptions that success allows us to keep. When things work, we rarely interrogate our methods. A successful outcome can make an imperfect strategy look brilliant. Failure does the opposite. It forces the machinery into the open. Suddenly you can see the weak preparation, the unrealistic expectation, the missing skill, the poor timing, the flawed communication, or the habit you had been ignoring. That exposure can be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is information arriving without decoration. The difficulty is that emotional pain tends to distort information. After failure, the mind can become selective. It remembers the embarrassment but forgets the lessons. It magnifies the mistake while minimizing everything that was done well. It turns one event into a prediction. This happened once, so it will happen again. That prediction feels convincing because disappointment gives fear a persuasive voice. Resilience does not require eliminating that voice. It requires learning not to hand it authority. A resilient person can say, "This hurt," without concluding, "Therefore I am finished." They can admit, "I made a serious mistake," without turning it into, "I am a mistake." That distinction is more than positive thinking. It protects the ability to respond intelligently. When identity becomes fused with failure, every correction feels like an attack on the self. When failure is treated as an event, correction becomes possible. This is why reflection matters, not endless rumination, where the same painful scene is replayed without producing insight, but deliberate examination. What actually happened? What was under my control? What was outside it? Which assumption proved wrong? What skill was missing? What warning did I overlook? What would I do differently if I faced the same situation again? These questions transform failure from a closed room into a workshop. There is also a subtle danger in romanticizing failure. Not every failure is secretly a gift, and not every setback contains an inspiring lesson waiting to be discovered. Some failures are simply painful. Some cost money, time, trust, or opportunities that cannot be recovered. Pretending otherwise can make genuine disappointment feel invalid. The healthier approach is more honest. Failure can hurt deeply, and it can still teach you something. Both truths can exist at the same time. The goal, then, is not to become someone who enjoys failure. It is to become someone who can metabolize it. You take the experience in, process it, extract what is useful, and refuse to let the residue poison everything that follows. Sometimes the lesson is to work harder. Sometimes it is to prepare differently. Sometimes it is to ask for help. Sometimes it is to change direction entirely. And sometimes the most important lesson is that a particular goal was never as meaningful as you believed. Persistence without reflection can become a prison. Reflection gives persistence a compass. The mature response to failure is therefore neither surrender nor blind optimism. It is curiosity. Curiosity creates distance between the wound and the conclusion. Instead of asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" you begin asking, "What is this showing me that I could not see before?" That question changes the quality of the next attempt. Failure may close one route, expose one weakness, or dismantle one expectation. But it does not automatically possess the authority to define the road ahead. What matters is what you do with the information left behind. The setback can become a scar you constantly protect, or it can become knowledge you carry forward. The difference is not whether you failed. Everyone who attempts something meaningful will eventually encounter that territory. The difference is whether you allow the experience to shrink your future or sharpen your understanding. Sometimes the most valuable thing failure gives you is not another chance, but a clearer view of how to use the next one. Chapter 6. The days nobody sees. There is a strange injustice in achievement. People usually notice it only after the difficult part is over. They see the published book, but not the evenings spent wrestling with unfinished pages. They see the successful business, but not the months when revenue was uncertain and every decision carried a little doubt. They see the confident speaker, but rarely remember the awkward presentations that came before. The finished result has a clean appearance. The process that created it is usually messy, repetitive, and almost invisible. Yet those unseen days are where persistence develops its deepest roots. A person can spend years preparing for something that receives only a few minutes of attention when it finally arrives. A musician may perform a 3-minute piece after thousands of hours of practice. An athlete may compete for a fraction of an hour after years of training. A student may receive a degree after years of reading, failing examinations, changing direction, and studying when nobody was watching. From the outside, achievement can look like an event. From the inside, it is usually a collection of ordinary days. This creates a psychological challenge. Human beings naturally crave recognition because recognition provides evidence. When someone notices our effort, the work feels validated. When nobody notices, doubt can become louder. You begin wondering whether the sacrifice is worthwhile, whether anyone will care, whether you are moving quickly enough, or whether you are simply spending your time on something that may never work. That uncertainty is particularly difficult in an age where visible outcomes are constantly displayed. People can encounter someone else's promotion, business success, financial milestone, physical transformation, or creative achievement in seconds. What they rarely see is the private history behind it. They see the polished surface and compare it with the unfinished interior of their own life. Comparison becomes especially dangerous when you compare your backstage with someone else's stage. A young writer might read a best-selling author's work and feel inadequate because the sentences appear effortless. What remains hidden are the abandoned drafts, rejected manuscripts, years of reading, editorial criticism, and countless hours spent learning how to construct an argument. A new entrepreneur may see another company's success and wonder why their own progress seems embarrassingly small. They do not see the failed products, difficult negotiations, early sacrifices, or years of uncertainty that preceded the visible result. The problem is not admiration, it is incomplete information. When you judge your progress against someone else's visible outcome, you are comparing two different realities. One contains your doubts, mistakes, unfinished work, and private disappointments. The other contains only what has become visible enough to be displayed. No comparison built on such unequal information can produce a fair conclusion. This is why persistence requires an internal scorecard. You need ways of measuring progress that do not depend entirely on applause. Did you become more capable? Did you understand something you previously misunderstood? Did you keep a promise you once would have broken? Did you handle difficulty with greater composure? Did you return to the work after disappointment? Did you make fewer mistakes because you learned from the previous ones? These forms of progress rarely attract attention, but they matter enormously. There is a quiet dignity in doing work that nobody celebrates yet. It means the reason for your effort is becoming stronger than the desire for recognition. You begin to discover whether you actually care about the craft, the contribution, the improvement, or the destination, or whether you were primarily attracted to the applause surrounding it. This distinction can be uncomfortable. Many ambitions contain an invisible desire to be seen. There is nothing inherently wrong with wanting recognition. Appreciation is human. The problem begins when recognition becomes the fuel rather than the reward. If applause is required for you to continue, silence will eventually stop you. The strongest persistence develops a private source of meaning. That does not mean becoming indifferent to results. Results matter. Feedback matters. Financial realities matter. Recognition can open doors and create opportunities. But external rewards should inform your journey rather than dictate your worth. When your entire sense of progress depends on how quickly other people respond, you surrender too much control to forces you cannot manage. Think of an architect working late inside an unfinished building. To someone passing outside, the structure may appear incomplete and unimpressive. Exposed wiring, temporary supports, scattered materials, and empty rooms reveal none of the final elegance. Yet the apparent disorder is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is evidence that construction is underway. Human development often looks like that from the inside. There are seasons when your life may appear unfinished because it is unfinished. You are learning. You are experimenting. You are developing judgment. You are discovering what does not work. You are building capacity that cannot yet be displayed. Expecting every season to look polished is an unrealistic demand. This is why patience and persistence belong together. Persistence keeps you engaged with the work. Patience prevents you from demanding that the work reveal its full value immediately. There will be days when nobody notices that you showed up. Nobody will know that you were tempted to quit and decided to continue. Nobody will applaud the email you finally sent, the chapter you completed, the workout you almost skipped, the money you chose not to spend, or the difficult conversation you handled more maturely than you would have a year ago. These moments may never become stories worth telling at a dinner table, yet they accumulate. Character is often assembled from decisions too ordinary to photograph. Eventually, some of those invisible decisions become visible consequences. Your knowledge becomes expertise. Your practice becomes competence. Your discipline becomes reliability. Your patience becomes judgment. Your repeated effort becomes a body of work. What looks sudden from the outside may have been quietly developing for years. This is why the unnoticed period should not be treated as wasted time. It is often the workshop in which the visible achievement is being manufactured. The world may not have a reason to applaud you yet. That does not mean the work has no value. Keep an internal record of what is changing. Notice the subtleties. Pay attention to the mistakes you no longer make, the difficulties you now handle with greater ease, and the responsibilities you can carry that once overwhelmed you. These are not consolation prizes. They are evidence. The days nobody sees are not the empty space between achievements. They are the substance of achievement itself. And when you learn to respect those days, you stop needing every step to look impressive. You become willing to build quietly, improve patiently, and continue without constant confirmation. One day, someone may call your progress remarkable. You will know that it was never one remarkable day. It was the accumulation of hundreds of ordinary ones in which you decided that being unseen was not the same as being unsuccessful. Chapter 7. Protect your persistence. A person does not always abandon a meaningful goal because the goal has become impossible. Sometimes the goal remains entirely achievable, but attention has been scattered so widely that there is no longer enough of it left to pursue anything properly. A little comparison here, an unnecessary commitment there, another distraction, another change of direction, another promise to begin again tomorrow. Nothing appears catastrophic in isolation, yet small interruptions can quietly dismantle a serious ambition. Persistence, therefore, is not only the ability to continue, it is also the ability to protect what you have decided is worth continuing. Consider how easily attention can become fragmented. You begin working toward a professional goal, but someone else's success makes you question your direction. You start exercising consistently, then encounter an advertisement promising faster results, and suddenly change your entire routine. You begin learning a valuable skill, become frustrated by the slow improvement, and switch to something else because it feels more exciting. You launch a project, receive little immediate response, and begin wondering whether another idea might be easier. The problem is not always laziness. Sometimes it is excessive responsiveness. You keep reacting to every new stimulus until your original intention has almost disappeared beneath the noise. Comparison is particularly effective at weakening persistence because it changes the question. Instead of asking, "Am I making meaningful progress?" you begin asking, "Am I progressing as quickly as that person?" The first question is useful because it connects you with your own trajectory. The second can become corrosive because it places your life inside someone else's timetable. You may be comparing your beginning with another person's middle, your private struggle with their public achievement, or your ordinary Tuesday with their most impressive year. Comparison does not merely create dissatisfaction, it can cause unnecessary redirection. A person who was steadily building something meaningful may suddenly abandon it because another path appears more glamorous. The new direction may indeed be worthwhile, but changing course because of envy, impatience, or insecurity is different from changing course because circumstances have genuinely changed. One is reaction, the other is judgment. Persistence requires judgment. This is why protecting your persistence begins with deciding what deserves your sustained attention. Not everything that demands your attention deserves it. Urgency and importance are not the same thing. A message can be urgent without being consequential. An opportunity can be attractive without being aligned with your deeper priorities. A criticism can be loud without being accurate. A setback can feel enormous without actually changing the validity of your goal. The ability to distinguish these things becomes increasingly valuable as your responsibilities grow. Without boundaries, every request becomes an interruption, and every new possibility becomes another unfinished commitment. Eventually, your energy is distributed across so many directions that none receives enough force to become significant. Perfectionism can create a similar problem from the opposite direction. Instead of scattering your attention across too many goals, perfectionism can make you afraid to continue with an imperfect one. You miss a few days and decide the routine has been ruined. You make a mistake in a project and feel compelled to start from the beginning. A piece of writing does not meet your expectations, so you postpone finishing it until you can somehow produce something flawless. The desire for excellence quietly becomes an excuse for avoidance. Perfectionism often disguises itself as high standards, but there is a crucial difference. High standards ask you to improve the work. Perfectionism can persuade you that unfinished or imperfect work is evidence that you should not continue at all. Persistence has room for imperfection. There is another threat that receives less attention: overcommitment. Some people do not struggle because they lack ambition. They struggle because they have too much of it in too many directions. They want to learn a language, build a business, become physically fit, read 50 books, improve their finances, master a new skill, maintain every relationship perfectly, and somehow remain completely rested. The ambition sounds admirable until reality sends the bill. Every commitment consumes some combination of time, attention, energy, and emotional capacity. Pretending otherwise does not make you more dedicated. It makes your system fragile. When too many priorities compete for limited resources, even meaningful goals begin to feel like burdens. Protecting persistence sometimes means saying no to something good so that you can remain faithful to something better. This does not require withdrawing from life or becoming rigid. Healthy persistence includes flexibility. There will be seasons when priorities shift, responsibilities increase, and circumstances demand adaptation. The purpose is not to construct an inflexible schedule that leaves no room for reality. It is to establish enough clarity that reality does not constantly rewrite your priorities for you. Your environment matters too. The people around you can influence what seems normal, possible, or worthwhile. Constant exposure to cynicism can make effort feel foolish. Constant exposure to unrealistic success stories can make ordinary progress feel inadequate. A supportive environment does not eliminate difficulty, but it can prevent unnecessary discouragement from becoming a permanent voice in your head. Even your internal language deserves attention. There is a significant difference between telling yourself, "I am behind," and saying, "I am still developing." The first creates a verdict. The second creates room for movement. This is not about pretending that you are further ahead than you are. It is about describing reality without turning it into an identity. Persistence becomes fragile when every setback becomes a statement about who you are. The strongest, persistent people learn to protect their mental bandwidth. They recognize that attention is finite, energy fluctuates, and focus can be depleted. They do not attempt to eliminate every distraction. They simply refuse to give every distraction equal authority. They understand that saying yes repeatedly can eventually become another form of saying no to their own priorities, their own peace, and their own long-term progress. There is also wisdom in recognizing when pressure has become destructive. Productive pressure can sharpen attention, encourage preparation, and create urgency. Destructive pressure erodes judgment, exhausts the mind, and turns every delay into a personal emergency. If your pursuit consistently requires you to destroy your health, relationships, or basic stability, the answer may not be to push harder. It may be to redesign the way you pursue the goal. That is an important part of intelligent persistence, knowing what must be protected while you continue. Your persistence is an asset. Treat it accordingly. Protect your attention from unnecessary comparison. Protect your goals from constant reinvention. Protect your energy from commitments that no longer matter. Protect your confidence from careless interpretations of temporary setbacks. Protect your standards from perfectionism that prevents completion. And protect your direction from the temptation to confuse every new possibility with a better one. Sometimes progress requires more effort. Sometimes it requires more patience. But there are moments when progress requires something quieter and more difficult: subtraction. You may not need another strategy. You may need fewer distractions. You may not need another goal. You may need greater commitment to the one already in front of you. You may not need to push harder. You may need to stop allowing everything else to pull you apart. Persistence is not simply the strength to remain on the path. It is the discernment to keep the path from disappearing beneath everything that competes for your attention. And when you learn to protect what matters, continuing becomes less about fighting every obstacle and more about refusing to surrender your direction to things that were never important enough to control it. Chapter 8. Become someone who finishes. There is a quiet difference between wanting to accomplish something and becoming the kind of person who follows through. The first lives in intention. The second is built through evidence. You can want to write a book, learn a language, improve your finances, become healthier, start a business, or complete a degree, but wanting does not yet tell you how you will behave when the novelty disappears. Character begins to reveal itself in the space between what you intend and what you repeatedly do. Think about the promises people make to themselves when nobody else is listening. I will start tomorrow. I will finish this next week. This time, I will stay consistent. These statements may begin with genuine determination, but when they are repeatedly broken, something subtle can happen. The consequence is not merely that a task remains unfinished. Your trust in your own word begins to weaken. You become less certain that the person making the promise is the same person who will eventually keep it. The opposite is also true. Every time you follow through on something meaningful, you create evidence. You tell yourself without needing to say it aloud that your intentions have weight. You planned to study, and you studied. You said you would finish the project, and you finished it. You promised yourself that you would save rather than spend, and you honored the decision. None of these actions may look extraordinary from the outside, yet together they construct something remarkably valuable: self-trust. Self-trust is not built through positive affirmations alone. It is built through repeated encounters with your own behavior. This is why finishing small things can matter more than making grand declarations. Someone who constantly begins ambitious projects but abandons them may possess plenty of enthusiasm but little evidence of follow-through. Another person may work quietly on modest commitments and complete them consistently. Over time, the second person can develop a confidence that does not require constant reassurance because it has been earned through experience. Imagine someone who decides to complete an online professional course. At the beginning, the goal feels manageable, the lessons are interesting, the certificate seems useful, and the future benefits are easy to picture. A few weeks later, however, the material becomes more demanding. Work becomes busy. The lessons become less exciting. The certificate still matters, but the emotional energy surrounding it has disappeared. At this point, completing the course becomes more than an educational task. It becomes an opportunity to practice reliability. Finishing does not mean completing everything you ever begin. That would be another form of rigidity. Some projects deserve to be abandoned because circumstances change, new information appears, or the original goal no longer makes sense. Wisdom includes knowing when to release something, but there is a meaningful difference between consciously changing direction and repeatedly walking away whenever discomfort appears. One is adaptation. The other is avoidance. People sometimes protect themselves from the discomfort of unfinished work by constantly replacing one goal with another. The new goal provides a fresh, emotional beginning, which feels much better than confronting the difficult middle of the old one. A new project offers possibility without demanding endurance. But if this pattern continues, a person can become highly skilled at starting and strangely unfamiliar with finishing. The middle is where identity is tested. At the beginning, you are allowed to be enthusiastic. Near the end, you can see the reward. In the middle, neither advantage is guaranteed. The work may be repetitive, the outcome uncertain, and the remaining distance difficult to estimate. This is where the temptation to move on becomes strongest. Yet every time you remain engaged through that uncomfortable middle, you develop a deeper understanding of yourself. You learn that boredom does not automatically mean the goal is wrong. You learn that frustration can coexist with commitment. You learn that imperfect work can still be completed. You learn that progress can continue even when confidence is temporarily absent. These lessons eventually change the way you see yourself. Instead of thinking, "I am trying to become disciplined," you begin to recognize, "I am someone who follows through." Instead of saying, "I hope I can handle difficult things," you possess memories that demonstrate you already have. Identity becomes less about what you claim and more about what your history can prove. This transformation is particularly powerful because the world cannot give it to you. Someone can praise your talent, promote you, congratulate you, or tell you that you are capable. But none of those things can substitute for the private knowledge that you can rely on yourself. There is a profound freedom in becoming dependable to yourself. It does not mean you will never procrastinate, hesitate, fail, change direction, or lose momentum. Perfection is not the requirement. Reliability means that when you drift, you know how to return. When you fail, you know how to recover. When you lose motivation, you know how to continue without waiting indefinitely for it to return. This is where persistence becomes more than a technique. It becomes part of your character. You begin to understand that every small commitment is a vote for the person you are becoming. One decision will not transform your identity, just as one missed day will not destroy it. But repeated behavior has a cumulative force. Over time, your actions become evidence, evidence becomes belief, and belief influences what you are willing to attempt next. The person who finishes is not necessarily the person who moves fastest. Often, it is the person who has learned to remain present when the work becomes ordinary. They understand that completion is rarely a dramatic final act. It is usually the consequence of returning again and again after the emotional excitement has disappeared. Perhaps the deepest reward of persistence is not the finished project, the promotion, the healthier body, or the achievement that others can see. It is the internal certainty that develops along the way. When life becomes difficult, you are not completely at the mercy of your circumstances or your moods. You have learned how to stay with something meaningful long enough to give it a genuine chance. And once you become someone who finishes, your future changes, not because every goal will succeed, but because you no longer approach difficulty as an automatic reason to walk away. Conclusion: keep going. There will always be a moment when progress becomes quieter than you expected. Motivation will fade, results will take longer, failure will interrupt your plans, and doubt will offer convincing reasons to stop. None of this means you have chosen the wrong path. Sometimes it simply means you have reached the part of the journey where persistence matters more than excitement. You have learned that persistence is not blind stubbornness. It is the ability to remain committed while staying flexible enough to learn, adjust, and change direction when necessary. It is discipline when motivation disappears, patience when results are delayed, courage after failure, and self-trust built through repeated follow-through. You do not need to move perfectly. You do not need to feel confident every day. You only need to keep making deliberate choices that protect what matters. Some days, progress will look like a breakthrough. Other days, it will look like showing up for 20 minutes when you wanted to disappear for a week. Both matter. The world may never see the countless ordinary decisions behind your eventual success. That is all right. Your life is not measured only by what becomes visible to others. So when the next difficult season arrives, do not ask whether the journey should always feel easy. Ask whether what you are pursuing is still worth becoming stronger for. If it is, adjust what needs adjusting, learn what needs learning, and take the next step. Because progress does not belong only to those who begin with determination. It belongs to those who develop the courage, discipline, and resilience to remain in motion long enough for their effort to become something real.